She was 20 years old and homeless. No family who would open the door for her, no plan beyond the bus station bench. Just a small canvas duffel and $10 she had folded into the inside pocket of her peacoat. And with that $10, she bought an abandoned train depot. At the end of a forgotten branch line in the Allegheny foothills of central Pennsylvania, in a township so small it had stopped appearing on the state highway map in 1972. The roof over the freight room had partly fallen in. The waiting room windows had been boarded for 40 years. The county said the building had been closed since 1958 and was scheduled for demolition the following spring. But what nobody knew was that beneath the floor of the old ticket booth in a sealed compartment that had not been opened in over 60 years was something that would change her life forever. Before we get to what she found, you need to understand where she came from. Because the story of Maeve Brennan does not begin with her. It begins with steel and steam and the men who rode the rails of eastern Pennsylvania when the railroads were the backbone of everything. It begins with her grandfather. Seamus Brennan came into this world in the winter of 1934. In a coal patch house in Lackawanna County, Pennsylvania. He was the youngest of 7 children born to a miner who breathed anthracite dust for 23 years before the black lung finally took him. The house had no indoor plumbing. The walls were thin enough that you could hear the wind arguing with itself on January nights. The only heat came from a cast iron stove that the children fed with whatever wood they could scavenge from the slag heaps and the railroad right-of-way. When Seamus was 15 years old, his father died on a Sunday morning in March. The mine company sent a man to the house that afternoon to collect the rent that was owed. The man wore a wool coat and carried a leather satchel, and he did not remove his hat when he stepped through the door. Seamus watched his mother count out the coins on the kitchen table. He watched her hands shake. He watched the man in the wool coat write something in a ledger and leave without saying thank you or goodbye or anything at all. The next morning, Seamus walked 4 miles to the railroad yard in Scranton and asked for a job on the section gang. The foreman looked at him for a long moment, taking in his thin shoulders and his calloused hands, and the way he stood with his feet apart, like a man who expected to be pushed. The foreman asked him how old he was. Seamus said 18. The foreman knew it was a lie, but he also knew that the boy in front of him had the kind of hunger that could not be argued with. He hired him on the spot. For the next 3 years, Seamus Brennan laid rail and replaced ties and cleared snow from the switches in weather that would have broken older men. He learned to read the steel to feel the subtle vibration that told you a train was coming long before you could see it. He learned that the railroad did not care about your feelings or your opinions or your plans for the future. It only cared about whether you showed up on time and whether you did your job. In 1952, he was promoted to brakeman on the Pennsylvania Railroad's Pocono Division. It was the job he had wanted since the first day he set foot in the yard. A brakeman rode the trains. A brakeman was not stuck in one place swinging a hammer and watching the same stretch of track day after day. A brakeman went places. For the next 24 years, Seamus Brennan rode the cabooses of freight trains through every kind of Pennsylvania weather. Through summer storms that turned the sky green and winter blizzards that buried the tracks under 6 feet of snow. Through fog so thick you could not see your own hand in front of your face, and autumn days so clear and golden that the hills looked like they were on fire. He carried a pocket watch in the breast pocket of his denim work shirt every day of his working life. It was a flat-topped silver timepiece on a worn leather cord. and it kept railroad time accurate to within 10 seconds a year. Railroad time was not like regular time. Regular time was approximate, flexible, subject to interpretation. Railroad time was absolute. A train arrived at a station at a particular moment or it did not, and there was nothing in between. No excuses, no explanations, no second chances. Seamus believed in railroad time the way some men believe in God. He believed that knowing the exact minute was a kind of duty to the people who depended on you. The passengers waiting on the platform, the crews at the next station, the dispatchers who kept the whole system running. If you were late, someone else had to adjust. If you were early, you threw off the schedule for everyone behind you. He set his watch every morning at 5 a.m. against the master clock in the Scranton Yard office. He wound it every night before bed. In 32 years, he was never late to work. Not once. Not even on the morning his wife went into labor with their only son. The baby was born at 7:42 in the morning. Seamus finished his shift at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, walked to the hospital and held his son for the first time at 3:47. He named the boy Michael after his own father who had died in the coal patch house when Seamus was 15. Michael Brennan grew up listening to his father's stories at the kitchen table in the small Scranton row house where the family lived. Stories about derailments and blizzards, and the time Seamus had to walk 3 miles through a February ice storm to reach a telephone and report a broken rail. Stories about the men he worked with, the engineers and conductors and yard workers who made up the unofficial family of the Pennsylvania Railroad. Michael loved those stories. He could recite them by heart by the time he was 10 years old. He knew the names of every type of freight car, boxcars and gondolas and hoppers and tank cars and reefers. He knew how the switches worked, how the signals communicated, how the whole vast system of steel and steam and human effort came together to move goods and people across 1,000 miles of track. But when he graduated from high school in 1986, Michael told everyone he was going to do something different with his life. Something that did not involve diesel fuel and frostbitten hands and the constant risk of injury or death. Something clean and safe and respectable. He got a job at an insurance office in downtown Scranton. He wore a tie every day. He sat at a desk and filled out forms and talked to customers on the telephone about their policies and their premiums and their claims. He told himself he was happy. He told himself this was what success looked like. For 2 years, he believed it. Then, on a Monday morning in the spring of 1998, Michael Brennan walked into the office, set his nameplate on his supervisor's desk, walked back out, and drove straight to the Conrail yard to apply for a job on the track maintenance crew. That night, he sat across the kitchen table from his father, in the same row house where Seamus had raised him, the same table where Seamus had told all those stories about the railroad, the same chairs where they had sat together 1,000 times before. Michael told his father what he had done. He told him about the feeling that had been growing in his chest for months. The feeling that something was wrong, that he was living someone else's life. That every morning when he put on that tie, he was putting on a costume that did not fit. Seamus listened without interrupting. When Michael finished, the old man was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached into the breast pocket of his flannel shirt and pulled out the silver pocket watch on its worn leather cord. He slid it across the table to his son. Michael looked at the watch. He looked at his father. He did not understand. Seamus said 4 words that Michael would remember for the rest of his life. A railroad man should always know what time it is. Michael took the watch. He put it around his neck on its leather cord. He wore it every day from that moment forward, just as his father had worn it for 32 years before him. 2 years later, in the spring of 2000, Michael Brennan married a woman named Nora Doherty at St. Patrick's Church in Scranton. Nora had grown up 3 streets over from the Brennan row house. She had red hair and green eyes and a laugh that could fill a room. She had loved Michael since they were teenagers, and she had waited for him through the 2 years he spent pretending to be someone he was not. Their daughter was born in the autumn of 2001. They named her Maeve after Nora's grandmother, who had come over from County Cork in 1923. She had her mother's red hair and her father's serious gray eyes, and from the very beginning a quality of stillness that made people think she was older than she was. For the first 12 years of Maeve's life, her father came home every evening with grease on his hands and the sweet diesel smell of the rail yards in his hair. He would wash up at the kitchen sink, and then he would sit at the table with his daughter and tell her stories. The same stories his father had told him. Stories about the railroad, about the men who built it, and the men who ran it, and the men who kept it running through every kind of weather and every kind of trouble. About the way steel does not lie, and gravity does not lie, and a train will arrive at a place at a particular time, or it will not, and there is nothing else to discuss. He taught her the names of the freight cars, boxcars and gondolas and hoppers and tank cars and reefers. He taught her how the switches worked. He taught her how to read a schedule. He taught her that railroad time was the only honest time there was. Sometimes on Saturday mornings, he would take her to the yard. They would sit on an overturned crate near the maintenance shed and watch the trains come and go. Michael would point out the different locomotives, explain what each one was hauling, tell her where it was headed and why. Maeve never got bored. She never complained about the noise or the smell or the cold. She just sat beside her father and watched and listened. Her small hands wrapped around a cup of hot chocolate, the silver pocket watch ticking against her father's chest. Those Saturday mornings were the happiest times of her childhood. She did not know they were numbered. On a cold morning in March of her 12th year, Maeve woke to the sound of her mother crying in the kitchen. It was not a gentle crying, not the kind of tears that come from a sad movie or a touching song. It was the sound of something breaking that could never be fixed. She got out of bed and walked down the narrow hallway. Her mother was sitting at the kitchen table with the telephone in her hand, and she was saying no, no, no over and over, as if she could change what she was hearing through sheer repetition. A freight train had derailed in the cut north of Pittston. A broken rail and a frozen tie plate. 2 cars had come off the tracks, and Michael Brennan had been on the ground crew responding to the derailment when the second car shifted and fell. The funeral was 3 days later. Maeve wore a black dress that her mother had bought for her the day before because she did not own one. She sat in the front pew of St. Patrick's Church and listened to the priest talk about her father as if he had known him, as if he understood what it meant to be a railroad man, what it meant to believe that showing up on time was a form of love. The priest did not know any of that. The priest was just saying words. After the service, after the burial, after the reception at the parish hall where people Maeve did not recognize ate casseroles and told her how sorry they were, she went up to her room and sat on her bed and looked out the window at the backyard where her father had pushed her on the swing when she was small. She did not cry. She wanted to cry. She felt like she should cry, but the tears would not come. Instead, she felt something else, a kind of coldness that started in her chest and spread outward until it reached her fingers and her toes. A feeling that the world had shifted somehow, that the ground under her feet was no longer solid, that nothing would ever be the same again. She was right. Seamus Brennan outlived his son by 14 months. He had been in declining health for years. His lungs damaged by decades of breathing diesel fumes and coal smoke, and the frozen air of Pennsylvania winters. But Michael's death accelerated something that had been happening slowly. It was as if the old man's heart simply decided it had had enough. He died on a Sunday morning in May, sitting in his armchair in the row house where he had lived for 50 years. The silver pocket watch was open on the table beside him, as if he had been checking the time when he went. Maeve was the only family left to inherit it. She put it on a leather cord around her neck the day after his funeral, and she wore it every day from that moment forward. The same watch that her grandfather had carried for 32 years. The same watch that her father had worn for the last 6 years of his life. She could feel it ticking against her collarbone. It felt like her grandfather still walking the line beside her. It felt like her father still coming home with grease on his hands and stories in his heart. It was all she had left of them. Her mother, Nora, did not handle the loss well. Some women love their husbands in a way that leaves room for everything else. Their children, their friends, their own separate selves. Some women love their husbands in a way that is total and consuming, a devotion so complete that it becomes the foundation upon which their entire lives are built. Nora Brennan loved Michael in the second way, and when he was gone, the foundation crumbled. For the first year after the accident, she barely left the house. She stopped cooking, stopped cleaning, stopped doing the small daily tasks that had once given her life its rhythm and shape. She would sit for hours in the living room staring at the television without really seeing it, a cup of cold tea in her hands. Maeve learned to take care of herself. She learned to make her own breakfast and pack her own lunch and do her own laundry. She learned to be quiet when her mother was having a bad day, which was most days. She learned to ask for nothing and expect nothing and need nothing from anyone. She was 13 years old, and she was already disappearing. In the second year, Nora started attending a grief support group at the Catholic church 3 blocks from the house. She told Maeve it was helping. She said it was good to talk to other people who understood what she was going through. Maeve wanted to believe her. At the grief support group, Nora met a man named Garrett Doyle. He was a few years older than her, divorced, no children. He worked as a supervisor at a warehouse on the outskirts of the city. He had broad shoulders and a firm handshake, and a way of listening that made Nora feel for the first time in 2 years like someone was paying attention to her. Within 6 months, they were engaged. Within 12 months, Garrett Doyle had moved into the row house on Maple Street. Maeve watched it happen with a growing sense of dread that she could not name or explain. There was nothing obviously wrong with Garrett. He did not yell or threaten or raise his hand. He was polite to Maeve in the way you might be polite to a stranger's child at a family gathering. But there was something else there too. A coldness. Not the kind that announces itself with cruelty or anger, but the kind that fills a room slowly, like fog rolling in off a river, until there is no warm corner left. He never asked Maeve about school. He never asked about her friends or her interests or her plans for the future. He never asked about the silver pocket watch she wore around her neck, or why she wore it, or what it meant to her. He simply acted as if she were not there. And slowly, gradually, over the course of months and then years, Nora began to do the same. It was not deliberate. Maeve understood that even then. Her mother was not trying to hurt her. Her mother was simply drowning, and Garrett was the only thing keeping her afloat, and there was no room on that particular raft for anyone else. By the time Maeve was 16, she had stopped expecting her mother to defend her. By the time she was 17, she had stopped expecting her mother to notice her at all. She got a job that year at a small diner near the old Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western rail yards in Scranton. The place was called Hetty's, and it was run by a woman named Hedwig Wisniewski. Hetty was in her early 60s. She had been widowed twice, once by a steelworker who had died in an accident at the Bethlehem plant in 1987, and once by a yard switchman who had suffered a heart attack at his post in 2003. She had no children and no remaining family that she spoke of. She ran the diner the way she ran her own life, with strong coffee, few wasted words, and an unspoken understanding that the people who came through her door were carrying things they did not always want to talk about. She hired Maeve for the afternoon busa shift on a Tuesday in September. She did not ask why a 16-year-old girl with serious gray eyes and a silver pocket watch around her neck needed a job on a school day. She did not ask about Maeve's family or her grades or her plans for the future. She just handed her an apron and showed her where the dish soap was kept. For the first 6 months, Hetty never asked Maeve a single personal question. She corrected her when she made mistakes, praised her when she did well, and otherwise left her alone to do her work. Then one evening in March, after the last customer had left and Maeve was wiping down the counter, Hetty sat down in the back booth with 2 cups of coffee and nodded at the seat across from her. Maeve sat down. She wrapped her hands around the warm cup. She waited. Hetty asked her one question. Just one. She asked about the pocket watch, and Maeve, who had not talked to anyone about her father or her grandfather, or anything that had happened in the past 4 years, started talking. She talked for nearly 4 hours. She told Hetty about Seamus and the railroad and the 32 years of freight trains through every kind of weather. She told her about Michael and the insurance office and the morning he walked out and never went back. She told her about the Saturday mornings at the rail yard and the names of the freight cars and the way her father had taught her to read a schedule. She told her about the accident in the cut north of Pittston, about the funeral at St. Patrick's, about the coldness that had started in her chest that day and never really went away. She told her about Seamus dying in his armchair, with the watch open on the table beside him, about inheriting it at 13 years old and wearing it every day since. She told her about Nora and Garrett and the slow disappearing. Hetty listened to all of it without interrupting. When Maeve finally finished, the coffee in both cups had long gone cold and the streetlights outside had come on. Hetty was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that Maeve did not expect. She said she had known Seamus Brennan. She had served him eggs and toast every Saturday morning for 19 years, from the time she opened the diner in 1976 until he retired in 1981 and stopped coming into the city as often. She knew his face and his voice and the way he always sat at the same stool at the counter and checked his watch against the clock on the wall, as if he did not quite trust it. She had known Michael, too. She had brought a casserole to the wake, though she doubted Maeve would remember. There had been so many people there. Hetty looked at Maeve across the formica table and something shifted in her weathered face. Something softened. "Then this booth is yours whenever you need it," she said. "You hear me, Brennan girl?" Maeve heard her. She finished high school living mostly out of her duffel bag. Some nights at home in the row house when Garrett was working late and her mother was having one of her better days. Some nights on the back bench in the diner kitchen after Hetty had locked up, wrapped in a blanket Hetty kept in the storage closet for exactly that purpose. Some nights at a friend's apartment when the friend's parents were not paying attention. She graduated in June of her 18th year. She walked across the stage in the gymnasium of West Scranton High School and accepted her diploma and shook hands with the principal. And no one in the audience was there to watch her do it. Her mother had said she would come. That morning, she had even put on a nice dress and done her hair. But when Maeve came downstairs, Garrett was sitting in the living room with the television on, and he looked up at Nora and said something Maeve could not hear. And Nora took off the dress and put on her bathrobe and did not leave the house. Maeve went to the graduation alone. She sat through the speeches and the music and the reading of names. She walked across the stage and collected her diploma and walked back to her seat and did not cry, because crying was not the right answer to that particular kind of disappointment. After the ceremony, she walked back to Hetty's. Hetty was waiting for her in the back booth with a piece of chocolate cake and a candle stuck in the top of it. "Happy graduation, Brennan girl," she said. "And happy birthday." Maeve had turned 18 that same week. She had almost forgotten. She got a second job that summer at another diner on Wyoming Avenue, and she started saving every dollar she could. She did not know what she was saving for. She just knew that she could not stay in the row house forever, and that when she finally left, she would need something to leave with. The pocket watch ticked against her collarbone every day. She thought of it as her grandfather still walking the line beside her. She thought of it as her father still teaching her that showing up on time was a form of love. She wore it even on the days when she was not sure she believed that anymore. In February of her 20th year, Maeve came home from a closing shift at the diner on Wyoming Avenue. It was late after midnight and the streets were quiet. A light snow was falling, the kind that makes everything look clean and new for a few hours before the plows and the traffic turn it to gray slush. She walked up the steps to the front porch of the row house. She reached for the door handle, and then she saw the box. It was a cardboard box sitting on the porch beside the door. The kind of box you might get from a liquor store with the name of a whiskey brand printed on the side. Inside the box were her clothes, her textbooks, the photograph of her father in his Conrail jacket that had hung on the wall of her bedroom since she was 12 years old, a few pieces of jewelry that had belonged to her grandmother, and on top of the box, set carefully in the center, was the silver pocket watch. Maeve stood very still looking at the watch. She understood immediately what it meant. Garrett had gone into her room. He had opened her dresser drawer where she kept the watch on the nights she did not wear it. He had taken it out and placed it on top of the box so that she could not pretend she had been forgotten, so that she would know this was intentional. There was a note taped to the front door, a folded sheet of lined notebook paper. The handwriting was her mother's. Maeve pulled it free and unfolded it and read it once, and then read it again because the first time she could not quite believe what she was seeing. The note said, "Maeve Garrett and I have decided this is the best thing for everyone. You are an adult now, We need our own space. Please do not come back tonight or any night. Please do not call. Mom. Maeve read the note twice. She tried the front door. Locked. She tried the back door, the side door, the basement door from the alley. Locked. All of them locked. She picked up the cardboard box. She hung the silver pocket watch back around her neck on its leather cord. And she walked the 11 blocks to Hetty's diner in the falling snow. She did not cry because crying was a private weather, and not the right answer to that particular kind of cold. Hetty was still there, closing up for the night. She looked through the window and saw Maeve standing on the sidewalk with a cardboard box in her arms and snow in her red hair. And she knew immediately that something had happened. She unlocked the door. She took the box from Maeve's arms. She turned the open sign to closed and led Maeve to the back booth and sat her down. Then she went to the kitchen and made her a plate of eggs and home fries and brought it to the table with a mug of coffee that was hot enough to burn. She did not ask any questions until Maeve had eaten. Then she asked one. Maeve told her. Hetty listened. When Maeve finished, Hetty nodded once slowly, as if she were confirming something she had suspected for a long time. Then she said the words that would change everything. You stay with me until you figure out what comes next. I've got a spare room above the diner that has been empty since my second husband died. It is yours. Maeve lived in that small upstairs room above Hetty's diner for 2 months. Hetty refused to let her pay rent. She said the rent was Maeve working the morning shift Tuesday through Saturday, which Maeve would have done for free anyway. Hetty fed her 3 meals a day. She washed Maeve's clothes in the small machine in the diner basement. She left a fresh bar of lavender soap on the bathroom shelf every Sunday, because Maeve had once mentioned in passing that her grandmother had used lavender soap. It was a small kindness, the kind of thing you might not even notice if you were not paying attention. But Maeve noticed. She noticed everything. She understood that Hetty was not trying to replace her family. She was not trying to be a mother or a grandmother or anything else. She was simply doing what she had always done, running her diner, keeping her own counsel and offering a warm booth to the people who needed one. It was the kindest 2 months of Maeve's life. But Maeve knew she could not stay forever. Hetty was nearly 62, and the diner was getting harder for her to run alone. The long hours, the heavy lifting, the constant small emergencies that come with running a business. Maeve could see it wearing on her, even if Hetty never complained. And Maeve did not want to become a person who needed someone else to carry her. She had been that person for too long already in the row house, with her mother and Garrett, invisible and dependent and slowly disappearing. She did not want to be that person anymore. She started looking for a place of her own. An apartment in Scranton was out of the question on diner wages. Even a studio in a decent neighborhood cost more than she could afford. She looked at rooms for rent in the rougher parts of the city places with bars on the windows and broken locks on the doors, and she could not bring herself to take any of them. Then, one evening in the back booth, she opened the old laptop that Hetty kept for customers to use. It was slow and the screen was cracked in one corner, but it connected to the internet. And that was enough. She did not know what she was looking for. She just started typing. Cheapest property, Pennsylvania. She pressed enter, and her whole life changed. The search results loaded slowly on the cracked screen, each link appearing one at a time, like cards being dealt from a worn deck. Most of them were what you would expect. foreclosure listings, tax lien sales, properties in neighborhoods where the asking price told you everything you needed to know about what you would be buying into. But the fifth result was different. It was a county surplus auction page from a place called Penn Forest Township, somewhere in the Allegheny foothills north of Bedford. Maeve had never heard of it. She was not sure she could find it on a map. The page listed 11 abandoned buildings being sold for nominal fees ahead of a planned demolition schedule. A Grange Hall with a collapsed roof. A one-room schoolhouse that had not held classes since 1954. A creamery, a blacksmith shop. A dance pavilion that had once hosted Saturday night socials for the farming families of the valley. And near the bottom of the list, in plain black text that did not call attention to itself in any particular way, was a listing that made Maeve's heart stop. Former Penn Central / PRR Branch Line Depot. Whitlock Junction. Abandoned 1958. Scheduled for demolition spring of next year. Price $10. Maeve sat very still in the back booth, her hands frozen above the keyboard. She read the listing 3 times, then a 4th, as if the words might change if she looked at them long enough. A train depot. A Pennsylvania Railroad depot. Abandoned the same year her grandfather had been riding the Pocono Division, learning the routes and the schedules and the particular rhythm of a life spent on steel rails. $10. She had $10. She had exactly $10 folded into the inside pocket of her peacoat, left over from her last paycheck after she had paid Hetty for the food she insisted on contributing to, despite Hetty telling her not to bother. $10. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The coffee maker gurgled in the kitchen. Outside, a car passed on the empty street, its headlights sweeping across the window and then disappearing into the dark. Maeve closed the laptop very carefully, as if it were something fragile that might break if she handled it wrong. Then she picked it up and carried it to the counter where Hetty was wiping down the coffee station, getting ready to close for the night. Hetty looked up. She saw something in Maeve's face that made her stop what she was doing and set down the rag. "What is it, Brennan girl?" Maeve opened the laptop and turned it around so Hetty could see the screen. She pointed to the listing for the depot at Whitlock Junction. Hetty leaned in close, squinting through her reading glasses at the small text. She read slowly, her lips moving slightly as she worked through the words. When she finished, she straightened up and looked at Maeve with an expression that Maeve could not quite read. Then Hetty said something that sent a chill down Maeve's spine. Whitlock Junction. I know that name. Maeve waited. Her heart was beating so hard she could feel it in her throat. Hetty was quiet for a long moment, her eyes unfocused, looking at something that was not in the room, something that was 60 years away and getting further every second. "Your grandfather used to talk about it," she said, finally. "Seamus. He was on temporary assignment to the Bedford branch in 1953 and 1954, before he got his regular posting on the Pocono Division. He used to come in here on Saturday mornings after he retired, and sometimes he would tell me about those early years, the places he had been, the people he had known." She paused and something shifted in her weathered face. A softness, a sadness. He talked about Whitlock Junction more than once. He said the station agent there made the best coffee on the division. Said he never figured out why it tasted better there than anywhere else. But it did. He used to joke that the man must have had a secret. Maeve's hand went to the pocket watch beneath her sweater, pressing it against her collarbone. Hetty was not finished. He also said it was the loneliest stop on the line. He said you could stand on the platform at midnight and hear the river in the valley below, but not a single other thing. No cars, no voices, no dogs barking. Just the river and the wind and the stars. The diner was very quiet. The coffee maker had stopped gurgling. The fluorescent lights seemed to hum louder in the silence. Maeve looked at the laptop screen at the words that were still glowing there. Former Penn Central / PRR Branch Line Depot. Whitlock Junction. Abandoned 1958. The same year her grandfather had been promoted to the Pocono Division. The same year he had stopped riding the Bedford branch and started the career that would last him another 23 years. She touched the pocket watch again. She could feel it ticking against her fingers, steady and patient, keeping time the way it had kept time for her grandfather and her father before her. "Hetty," she said, "I think I'm going to go look at it." Hetty studied her face for a long moment. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her, because she nodded once and turned back to the coffee station. "I think you are too Brennan, girl. Take the bus. I will write you down for 2 days off." The bus from Scranton to Bedford took most of a day with 2 transfers and a 3-hour layover, in a station that smelled like diesel fuel and stale cigarettes. Maeve sat in the back row with her duffel bag on the seat beside her and watched Pennsylvania scroll past the window like a film she had seen before, but could not quite remember. The landscape changed as the bus moved west and south. The cities gave way to towns, and the towns gave way to villages, and the villages gave way to nothing at all. Just hills and forests and the occasional farmhouse set back from the road, smoke rising from its chimney into the gray February sky. The final leg of the journey was a county shuttle that ran twice a week on Tuesdays and Fridays, connecting the scattered communities of the Allegheny foothills to the larger towns where people did their shopping and their banking and their dying. The shuttle was a converted school bus with the seats ripped out and replaced with wooden benches. There were only 3 other passengers: an old man with a newspaper, a woman with 2 grocery bags, and a teenager with headphones who did not look up once during the entire ride. The driver dropped Maeve at a crossroads 4 miles from the township office. There was nothing there except a faded stop sign and a gravel pullout where the shuttle could turn around. 4 miles, the driver said. Straight down that road. You will see the general store first. Then the township office is right next to it. He looked at her duffel bag and her thin coat and her serious gray eyes. "You sure you know what you are doing out here?" Miss Maeve thanked him and stepped off the bus. She walked the 4 miles. The road wound through narrow valleys of bare winter hardwood, the trees skeletal against the white sky. The air smelled like wet leaves and wood smoke, and something else, something clean and cold that she could not identify. It was the smell of a place that had been left alone for a long time. A place that had forgotten it was supposed to be part of the world. The pocket watch ticked against her collarbone the whole way. She found herself matching her steps to its rhythm, 1 foot in front of the other. Steady and patient the way her grandfather had walked the rails for 32 years. She did not think about what she was doing. She did not think about whether it made sense, or whether it was practical, or whether anyone in their right mind would spend their last $10 on an abandoned building in a township that had stopped appearing on maps. She just walked. The Penn Forest Township office was a small frame building beside a general store that had a closed sign in the window and a layer of dust on the merchandise visible through the glass. The main street, if you could call it that, had 7 other buildings on it. A church with a white steeple, a volunteer fire station with a single truck parked in the open bay, a post office the size of a garden shed, a few houses with porches and rocking chairs, and American flags hanging limp in the still air. It looked like a place that had been frozen in time, a place that had decided at some point in the past that it was finished changing and had simply stopped. Maeve pushed open the door of the township office and stepped inside. The room was small and warm, heated by a wood stove in the corner that crackled and popped as she entered. Behind a wooden counter sat a woman in her 50s with gray-streaked hair, pulled back in a practical bun, and reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. She was holding a mug of tea in one hand and a property record in the other, and she looked up with an expression of mild surprise when Maeve walked in. Her name was Dorrit Schultz. She had been the township clerk for 19 years, which was longer than some of the residents had been alive. She knew every property in Penn Forest Township by heart, every owner and every tax record, and every piece of paper that had ever been filed in the cabinets behind her desk. She also knew when someone was about to do something interesting. "You are here about the depot," she said. It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am." Dorrit set down her tea and her property record and studied Maeve over the top of her reading glasses. She took in the duffel bag and the thin coat and the serious gray eyes and the silver pocket watch just visible beneath the collar of her sweater. "You know it has been closed since '58, she said. "The roof over the freight room is half gone. The track was pulled up in '61. There is no power and no water. The county is going to take it down in March." "Yes, ma'am." "I read the listing." Dorrit continued to study her. Her eyes were sharp, the eyes of a woman who had spent 2 decades watching people come and go, watching them make decisions both wise and foolish, watching them succeed and fail, and sometimes disappear entirely. "You know there is nothing out there," she said. "No neighbors within a mile. No telephone lines. The nearest paved road is 3 miles away." "Yes, ma'am." "And you want to buy it anyway?" "Yes, ma'am." "I have $10. There was a long silence. The wood stove crackled. A clock on the wall ticked steadily, keeping time in a way that would have satisfied Maeve's grandfather. Then Dorrit Schultz did something unexpected. She smiled. It was not a big smile. It was not the kind of smile you would notice if you were not paying attention. But it was there, a small softening at the corners of her mouth, a slight crinkling around her eyes. She turned to the shelf behind her and pulled down a heavy leather-bound book, a deed book, the kind that had been used to record property transfers in small towns since before anyone could remember. She opened it to a page near the back, a page that looked like it had been waiting there for a very long time. "Sign here," she said, pointing to a line at the bottom of the page, "and here, and here." And Maeve stepped up to the counter. Dorrit handed her a pen, an old-fashioned fountain pen with a brass nib that had been worn smooth by decades of use. Maeve signed her name 3 times. Maeve Marie Brennan. She signed it in the careful, slanted hand that her grandfather had taught her when she was small. the hand that railroad men used when they filled out waybills and manifests and all the other paperwork that kept the trains running on time. Dorrit took the $10 bill that Maeve offered. She folded it once precisely and tucked it into a metal cash box on the counter. Then she pulled out a brass stamp, the kind with a wooden handle and a heavy base, and pressed it firmly onto the deed. The stamp made a soft, flat sound like a door closing. "It is yours," Dorrit said. "A mile and a half down the old rail bed if you walk it." She paused and looked at Maeve's thin coat again. "You want to ride? My husband has the truck out front." The truck was an old Ford pickup green with rust spots on the fenders and a bench seat that had been patched with duct tape in several places. Dorrit's husband was a quiet man named Bernard, who did not ask any questions during the drive, just steered the truck down a series of increasingly narrow roads until they reached a place where the pavement ended and a dirt track began. He stopped the truck at the edge of a clearing and pointed through the windshield. "There," he said. "That is Whitlock Junction." Maeve looked, and for a long moment she forgot how to breathe. The depot stood in a clearing where the old rail bed widened into what had once been the passing siding. It was a single-story building of dark red, board and batten siding faded to the color of dried clay by 60 years of weather. A wide overhanging eave ran the length of the platform side supported by simple wooden brackets. A peaked shingle roof rose above it, patched in places where the original shingles had blown away, and a tall brick chimney climbed the back wall. At the near end of the building, a small bay window projected toward where the tracks had once been. The glass was dirty and cracked, but still intact. Above the window, painted in faded white letters on a board that had once been dark green, was the original station sign. Whitlock Junction, Pennsylvania Railroad. The platform was still there, running the length of the building made of weathered boards that had gone gray and green with age and moss. Beyond it, the rail bed stretched away into the woods, a long, straight scar in the forest, where the ties and rails had been pulled up more than 60 years ago. The ballast was still visible in patches pale gravel, showing through where the leaves had not yet covered it. It was the loneliest place Maeve had ever seen. It was the most beautiful place she had ever seen. Dorrit's husband handed her the key. It was an old iron key, heavy and cold, the kind that had been made by a blacksmith, rather than stamped out by a machine. "There is a bench inside that will do for sleeping if you have a sleeping bag," he said. "I will come back in 2 days." Then he drove away, and Maeve was alone in the clearing with the depot and the silence and the long empty rail bed running away into the trees. She stood there for a long time just looking. The wind moved through the bare branches overhead, making a sound like whispered conversation. Somewhere in the distance she could hear water running. The river that her grandfather had talked about, the one you could hear from the platform at midnight. The pocket watch ticked against her collarbone, steady and patient, keeping time. Maeve walked across the clearing to the platform. The boards creaked under her feet, but they held. She climbed the 3 steps to the platform level and crossed to the waiting room door. The door was solid oak weathered to a silver gray, with a brass handle that had gone green with age. She fitted the iron key into the lock and turned it. The door swung open with a sound like a long exhale. The waiting room was a single long space with a slate floor that had been scuffed soft by 60 years of feet. The walls were dark, wainscoting the wood gone almost black with age. A wooden bench ran along one wall and a black pot-bellied stove sat in the corner, cold and silent. At the far end of the room was a closed wooden door set into the wall beneath the bay window. The ticket booth. The air smelled like cold cinder and old paper, and the faint, sweet smell of pine boards. It smelled like a place that had been waiting for someone to open the door. Maeve walked the length of the room slowly. She put her hand on the cold iron of the pot-bellied stove. She put her hand on the wooden bench, feeling the smooth grain where generations of travelers had sat and waited for trains that no longer ran. She put her hand on the closed door of the ticket booth. She turned the brass knob. The door swung open. The ticket booth was a small space, perhaps 6 feet square. A high wooden desk faced the bay window, positioned so that the station agent could watch for incoming trains. A tall wooden stool stood behind the desk. A row of pigeonholes was built into the wall for waybills and receipts. A small iron safe with a combination dial sat on the floor in the corner. And on the wall beside the window, a chalkboard was mounted for writing arrival and departure times. The last entry was still there, ghosted in faint white chalk that had somehow survived 60 years of silence. 6:42 p.m. eastbound final. Maeve read the words 3 times. She thought about the station agent who had written them on that last day in June of 1958, knowing that no more trains would come, knowing that he was recording the end of something that had been part of his life for decades. She sat down on the wooden stool behind the desk and looked out through the bay window at the empty rail bed. She thought about her grandfather who had sat on a stool exactly like this one, in a depot exactly like this one when he was younger than she was now. She thought about the stories he had told her father at the kitchen table in Scranton, stories that her father had told her on Saturday mornings at the rail yard. She thought about the silver pocket watch around her neck, which had been kept on railroad time for 50 years, by men who understood that being on time was a form of respect, a form of duty, a form of love. She slid off the stool to look at the floor beneath it. The floorboards in the ticket booth were old pine, the same as the rest of the building. But the boards directly beneath the stool were a slightly different color than the surrounding boards. Darker, as if they had been replaced at some point and had aged differently than the originals. Maeve knelt down and ran her fingertips along the seam where the darker boards met the lighter ones. She felt a gap, a deliberate gap, smooth cut. The kind of gap that does not happen by accident. Her heart began to beat faster. She went back out to the freight room, picking her way carefully around the section where the roof had fallen in. Against one wall, among the debris of 60 years, she found a piece of flat iron that might once have been part of a switch lever. She brought it back to the ticket booth. She knelt down beside the dark boards and worked the edge of the iron into the gap. She applied pressure, gently at first, then harder. The boards shifted. She tried again, finding a better angle. The iron bit into the wood and the boards lifted, coming up together in a small section, about 18 inches square. They were hinged. Leather hinges, old and stiff with age, but still holding. Someone had cut these boards out and put them back on hinges so they could be opened and closed. Someone had created a hiding place. Maeve lifted the section of floor and set it aside. Beneath it was a small wooden compartment fitted into the space between the floor joists. It had been lined with tar paper to keep out moisture, and it was dry and clean despite the decades that had passed. Inside the compartment, lying on a piece of old oilcloth, were 3 objects: a tin lockbox, a sealed envelope, and a folded American flag. Maeve sat very still for a moment, her hands trembling. The pocket watch ticked against her collarbone, marking the seconds, keeping time, the way it had always kept time. Then she reached into the compartment and lifted out the objects one at a time. The tin lockbox was heavy. It was the kind of small fireproof box that a station agent might have used to keep the day's cash receipts before the night train came to collect them. The lid was held closed by a simple latch, not a lock. The envelope was made of thick, cream-colored paper. The ink on the front was faded to brown, but the handwriting was clear and careful. It said, "To whoever finds this." The flag was a small American flag, neatly folded in the triangular military fold. Maeve counted the stars through the thin fabric. 48. This flag had been made before 1959, before Alaska and Hawaii were admitted to the Union. She opened the lockbox first. Inside, in neat rows, were bundles of banknotes, old currency. United States bills from the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s. 20s and 50s, and at the bottom, a small stack of hundreds held together with paper bands that crumbled at the edges when she touched them. Maeve's hands shook as she counted. $9,320. Beneath the bills was a small leather pouch, soft with age. She opened it and found 11 silver dollars, each one wrapped in tissue paper. And beneath the silver dollars, nestled in a bed of faded velvet, was a pocket watch, a Hamilton 992B in a silver hunting case. Maeve recognized it immediately. It was the same make and model as the watch that had hung around her grandfather's neck for 32 years. The same watch that had been issued to every Pennsylvania railroad agent and conductor as the standard timepiece of the line. She set the pouch carefully aside and picked up the envelope. Her fingers trembled as she broke the seal. Inside was a letter written on heavy cream paper. The ink had faded to brown with age, but the handwriting was clear and careful. The hand of a man who had spent his life filling out waybills and timetables and all the other paperwork of the railroad in a small, neat slant that was easy to read even after 60 years. The letter began, "To whoever finds this, my name is Emmett Yoder. I have been the station agent at Whitlock Junction on the Bedford branch of the Pennsylvania Railroad from 1932 until today, the 17th of June, 1958. The branch line is being closed at the end of this week. The last passenger train will run on Friday evening. After that, the rails will be pulled and the building will be locked. And there will be no reason for anyone to come here again. I am 64 years old, and I have no children. My wife Alma passed in the influenza spring of 1949. I have spent my years at this small junction, watching trains come in from Bedford in the morning and go out toward Pittsburgh at night. I have known every regular passenger by name. I have made a pot of coffee every morning at 5 o'clock for the brakeman on the through freights, even though it was not part of my duties. I considered it my duty anyway. Coffee is a small kindness. And a small kindness on a cold morning is sometimes the difference between a good day and a hard one. Maeve stopped reading. Her eyes were blurring and she had to blink several times before she could continue. I have saved a portion of every paycheck I ever drew in this lockbox, beneath the floor of the booth where I have sat for 26 years. I do not trust banks. I lost what little I had in the failure of the Bedford Trust in 1933, and I have nowhere else to put what I have saved. The silver dollars are from Alma's family. The Hamilton watch was issued to me by the railroad in 1934, and I am leaving it behind because I do not want to carry railroad time after Friday. If you are reading this letter, you came into this depot after I am gone. Maybe long after. Maybe the building has been forgotten. Maybe you came looking for shelter or quiet or a place to begin again. Whatever brought you here, I want you to know that the depot has been waiting for you. A small station is a kind of patient thing. It waits for the train, and then it waits for the next train, and then eventually, when there are no more trains, it waits for whoever will come next. I have been the one waiting at Whitlock Junction since 1932. I am leaving the waiting to you now. Take what is in this box. It is for you. The flag is from Alma's brother, who was a brakeman on the Erie and was killed in a coupling accident in 1944. Keep it folded the way I have folded it. Be kind to the building. The coffee tastes better here than anywhere on the division. I do not know why, and I have stopped trying to find out. Emmett Yoder Station, Agent Whitlock Junction, June 17th, 1958. Maeve read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully along its original creases and placed it back in its envelope. She sat very still on the floor of the ticket booth, with the banknotes and the silver dollars and the Hamilton pocket watch in her lap, and the small folded flag beside her. She did not cry. Her grandfather had not been a man who cried, and she had inherited his hands and his watch and his particular kind of restraint. But she said aloud to the empty depot, and to whoever might be listening, the only words that seemed right. "Thank you, Mr. Yoder. I will try." The silence of Whitlock Junction settled around her like a blanket. Through the bay window, she could see the light beginning to fade as the winter afternoon moved toward evening. The shadows of the trees stretched longer across the empty rail bed. The air grew colder. Maeve sat on the floor of the ticket booth for a long time, holding the two pocket watches, one from her grandfather passed down through her father to her, one from a stranger who had waited 60 years for someone to find his hiding place. She opened them both. They showed the same time, exactly the same to the second. Railroad time. Maeve looked at the Hamilton in her right hand and the silver watch in her left. Two timepieces separated by decades, kept by men who had never known each other, but who had believed in the same things. Precision. Duty. The quiet dignity of showing up when you said you would. Emmett Yoder had not known Seamus Brennan. He had not known that a young brakeman would one day ride through Whitlock Junction on the Bedford branch and drink his coffee and remember it for the rest of his life. He had not known that the same brakeman's granddaughter would walk through the door 60 years later with $10 in her pocket and nowhere else to go. But somehow, in a way that Maeve could not explain and did not try to, the wait-in had found its purpose. She closed both watches and hung her grandfather's back around her neck. The Hamilton she placed carefully on the station agent's desk, where Emmett Yoder had kept it for 26 years. Then she stood up and walked out of the ticket booth and through the waiting room and onto the platform. The sun was setting behind the ridge to the west. The sky had turned the color of old copper, and the bare branches of the trees were black against it. The empty rail bed glowed in the fading light, a pale ribbon running away into the gathering dark. Maeve stood on the platform where 1,000 passengers had stood before her, waiting for trains that would never come again. She could hear the river, just like her grandfather had said. A soft, rushing sound carried up from the valley on the cold evening air. And nothing else. No cars, no voices, no dogs barking. Just the river and the wind and the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. She touched the pocket watch beneath her sweater. Somewhere inside the depot, the Hamilton 992B that Emmett Yoder had left behind was still keeping time, ticking in the darkness of the ticket booth, patient and precise, waiting for someone to wind it. Maeve would wind it tomorrow. Tonight she would sleep on the bench in the waiting room wrapped in the blanket she had brought from Scranton. She would listen to the silence and the river and the wind in the bare branches. And in the morning she would begin. The next 2 days passed in a kind of dream. Maeve walked every inch of the depot inside and out. She made a list in a small notebook of everything that needed to be done. The roof over the freight room half collapsed, would have to be reframed and shingled before the spring rains came. The bay window needed new glass. The pot-bellied stove needed its flue cleaned before she could safely light a fire. She found the well behind the depot, covered with a rotting wooden lid, but otherwise intact. She would need a new hand pump, but the well itself was sound. She walked the old rail bed in both directions, following it through the winter woods until it disappeared into the underbrush. She found the place where the tracks had crossed the river, on a wooden trestle now gone, leaving only the stone abutments on either side. She sat on those abutments and looked down at the water moving below, dark and cold and endless, and she thought about all the trains that had crossed here in the years before she was born. All the passengers looking out the windows at the winter hills. All the brakemen riding the caboose, watching the track behind them disappear around the curve. All the people who had passed through Whitlock Junction and never known what was hidden beneath the floor of the ticket booth. On the second afternoon, Dorrit's husband came back in the green pickup truck. He found Maeve on the platform, sitting on the bench that ran along the front of the waiting room. She had the notebook open on her lap and a pencil in her hand, and she was looking at the rail bed with an expression that he could not quite read. He asked if she was ready to go back. Maeve looked at him for a long moment. Then she shook her head. "I am not going back," she said. "I am staying." Bernard Schultz was a quiet man, not given to asking questions or offering opinions, but something in his face shifted when she said those words. A kind of recognition, a kind of respect. He nodded once and drove away. That evening, Maeve counted out a portion of the money from the lockbox. Enough for supplies, enough for materials, enough to begin. She would not spend Emmett Yoder's money recklessly. She would not waste it on things she did not need. She would keep most of it safe in a credit union in Bedford, and she would use it the way he would have wanted her to use it. Carefully, patiently, one board at a time. The next morning, she walked the 4 miles back to the crossroads and caught the county shuttle to Bedford. She opened an account at the credit union with most of the cash from the lockbox. She bought a bundle of cedar shingles at the hardware store and a bucket of roofing tar and a second-hand kerosene cook stove that the owner said still worked fine if you were not particular about the smell. She bought a proper mattress, thin but clean, and a wool blanket, and 2 pairs of work gloves, and a claw hammer and a handsaw, and a box of galvanized nails. She hired a man with a pickup truck to drive her and her supplies back to the depot. He charged her $10 for the trip, and she paid him without complaint, and she did not tell him about the money in the lockbox or the letter from Emmett Yoder. or any of the rest of it. Some things were not for sharing. The rebuilding took patient months. Maeve learned to shingle a roof by watching videos on the computer at the library in Bedford. She made mistakes and corrected them. She learned which nails to use and which hammer strokes work best. She learned that cedar shingles split if you drove the nail too close to the edge and that roofing tar needed to be warm before you spread it. And that working alone meant you had to think 3 steps ahead at all times. She learned to hang a door by asking an old man at the diner in Bedford, a retired carpenter named Aldrich Moser. Aldrich was 82 years old with hands that shook slightly, but still knew their way around a tool. He came out to the depot on a Saturday afternoon with his own tools and showed Maeve how to set the hinges, how to shim the frame, how to plane the edge until the door swung true. He would not let her pay him. When she tried to press some bills into his hand, he waved them away and said that some things were not about money. Some things were about making sure the old ways did not disappear entirely. He came back twice more, once to help with the bay window, and once to look at the pot-bellied stove. Each time he refused payment. Each time he stayed a little longer drinking coffee on the platform and telling Maeve stories about the old days when the trains still ran and the valley was full of farms and families. The people of Penn Forest Township began to notice her. Dorrit Schultz came by every Wednesday with a thermos of coffee and the township newsletter. She never asked what Maeve was doing with the depot or where she had gotten the money for supplies. She just sat on the platform bench and drank coffee and talked about the weather and the neighbors and the small dramas of township life. She was, Maeve realized, keeping an eye on her, making sure she was all right, making sure she was not in over her head. It was the kind of watchfulness that did not announce itself, the kind that simply showed up week after week with a thermos and a newsletter and no expectation of gratitude. Chester Webb was a retired Conrail engineer who lived in a small cabin 4 miles from the depot. He was 76 years old and had spent 40 years riding locomotives through the mountains of central Pennsylvania. He had heard from Dorrit that a young woman was fixing up the old Whitlock depot, and one afternoon he drove out in his old Ford pickup to see for himself. He found Maeve on the roof of the freight room hammering shingles in the thin spring sunlight. He watched her work for a few minutes, saying nothing. Then he went back to his truck and lifted out a wooden crate that he had been keeping in his attic for 40 years. Inside the crate were railroad memorabilia, old timetables from the Bedford branch, a brass conductor's lantern still bright despite its age, a Pennsylvania Railroad porcelain mug with a chip on the rim, a section of original rail with the date 1928 stamped into the web. He set the crate on the platform and looked up at Maeve on the roof. "These belong here more than they belong with me," he said. Then he got back in his truck and drove away. He came back every other Sunday for the rest of the year. Sometimes he helped with the work holding boards while Maeve nailed them or carrying supplies from the road. Mostly he just sat on the platform bench and drank coffee and talked about the old line. He told her about the locomotives he had driven and the crews he had worked with and the wrecks he had seen and the close calls he had survived. He told her about the last days of the Bedford branch, when everyone knew the end was coming, but nobody wanted to be the one to say it out loud. He told her about Whitlock Junction, about pulling into the station on cold mornings and seeing the light in the ticket booth window, and knowing that Emmett Yoder would have a pot of coffee waiting. Maeve listened to all of it. She wrote some of it down in her notebook so she would not forget. And slowly, day by day and week by week, the depot began to come back to life. By April, the roof over the freight room was tight. The new shingles were a lighter color than the originals, but they would darken with age. In a few years, you would not be able to tell the difference. By May, the bay window held new glass. Maeve had ordered it from a specialty shop in Pittsburgh, cut to the exact dimensions of the original panes. When the light came through it in the early morning, it cast squares of gold on the ticket booth floor. By June, the pot-bellied stove was cleaned and working. The flue had been full of bird nests and old leaves, and it had taken Maeve most of a day to clear it out. But when she lit the first fire, the smoke rose clean and straight, and the cast iron began to tick and ping as it heated up. The waiting room had a swept slate floor and a fresh coat of paint on the wainscoting. Dorrit had sewn curtains for the windows, simple cotton in a pattern of blue and white checks. They were not fancy, but they softened the light and made the room feel like a place where people were meant to be. Maeve made a small bedroom for herself in the freight room in the corner where the roof had been repaired. She set up the iron cot she had bought in Bedford and covered it with the wool blanket. On a shelf above the cot, she placed the framed photograph of her father in his Conrail jacket. Beside the photograph, she placed her grandfather's silver pocket watch on its leather cord. And on the station agent's desk in the ticket booth, she placed the Hamilton 992B that Emmett Yoder had left behind. She wound it every morning and set it to railroad time the way Emmett would have set it, the way her grandfather had set his watch every morning for 32 years. 2 timepieces keeping the same time in a building that had learned to wait. In the second month, Hedwig Wisniewski drove down from Scranton. She came in her old Buick, the one she had been driving for 15 years and refused to replace, and the trunk was full of boxes. And the boxes were full of things from Maeve's room above the diner. Clothes and books and the few possessions that Maeve had left behind when she took the bus to Bedford. And one other thing. A small framed photograph of Declan Brennan in his Conrail jacket. Hetty had found it in the box in the back of the storage closet. Maeve had given it to her for safekeeping years ago when things at the row house had gotten bad, and she was afraid her mother might throw it away. Maeve had forgotten about it, or maybe she had not forgotten so much as pushed it to a place in her mind where she did not have to look at it. But Hetty had not forgotten. Hetty had kept it safe for years, waiting for the right time to give it back. She handed it to Maeve on the platform of Whitlock Junction in the golden light of a spring afternoon, and she watched as Maeve looked at her father's face for the first time in years. Maeve did not cry, but she held the photograph for a long time, tracing the lines of her father's face with her fingertip, remembering the sound of his voice and the smell of diesel in his hair, and the way he had taught her to read a railroad schedule on Saturday mornings at the yard. Hetty stayed for 3 days. She slept on a folding cot that Maeve had set up in the freight room. She helped paint the inside of the ticket booth a soft cream color that made the small space feel twice as large. She cooked meals on the kerosene stove and told stories about the old days in Scranton, about Seamus and the Saturday morning eggs, about the customers who had come and gone over the years. On the morning she left, Hetty stood beside her Buick in the clearing and looked at Maeve for a long moment. Seamus would be proud, she said. Declan would be proud. You are a Brennan in the only way that matters. Then she got in her car and drove back to Scranton. Maeve stood on the platform and watched until the car disappeared around the curve of the road. Then she sat down on the bench and looked out at the empty rail bed. And for the first time since the cold February night, when she had read the note on the door of the row house, she let herself cry. The tears came slowly at first, and then faster, until she was sobbing with her face in her hands. She cried for her father and her grandfather, and the life she had lost. She cried for her mother who had loved too much and broken too completely. She cried for the girl she had been invisible and dependent and slowly disappearing. She cried for all of it. And when she was done, when the tears had run their course and the sun had moved across the sky and the shadows had grown long on the platform, she wiped her face and stood up and went back to work. There was still so much to do. She started serving coffee in the summer. It was not a business at first. It was not something she had planned or thought through or written down in her notebook alongside the lists of repairs and supplies. It was simply a thing she did the way Emmett Yoder had done it for the brakeman on the through freights, even though it was not part of his duties. She considered it her duty anyway. She kept a kettle hot on the pot-bellied stove, even in July, when the heat made the waiting room feel like the inside of a bread oven. She stacked mismatched mugs on the shelf beside the bay window mugs she had collected from thrift stores in Bedford and yard sales in the valley, no two of them alike. She bought coffee in bulk from a supplier in Pittsburgh who shipped it in brown paper bags that smelled like heaven when you opened them. And she waited. The first visitor came on a Tuesday morning in the third week of June. He was a hiker, a man in his 60s with a gray beard and a backpack and hiking poles that clicked against the platform boards as he climbed the steps. He had been walking the old rail bed from Bedford, following the route of the vanished tracks through the summer woods. He had not expected to find anything at Whitlock Junction except maybe a foundation and some overgrown weeds. Instead, he found Maeve sitting on the platform bench with a mug of coffee in her hands, and the morning light slanting through the trees. She offered him a cup. He accepted. They sat together on the bench for an hour, not saying much, just watching the light move across the empty rail bed and listening to the birds in the trees and the distant sound of the river in the valley below. When he left, he tried to give her money for the coffee. She refused. He came back the following Tuesday with his wife. Word spread the way word spreads in small places. Not through newspapers or advertisements or any of the usual channels, but through the quieter networks of conversation and connection that bind small communities together. A hiker mentioned the depot to a friend. The friend mentioned it to a neighbor. The neighbor told someone at church. By August, Maeve was serving coffee to a dozen visitors a week. They came from all over. Hikers and birders and railroad history enthusiasts who had heard about the restored depot on the old Bedford branch. Photographers looking for picturesque ruins who were surprised to find something that was not ruined at all. Retired railroaders who remembered the days when the trains still ran and wanted to see what remained. They came looking for different things. Some came for the history, wanting to touch the old wood and read the faded signs and imagine what it had been like when the 642 eastbound was still running. Some came for the quiet, seeking a place where the noise of the modern world could not reach them. Some came because they were lost, not geographically, but in the deeper ways that people get lost, and they had heard that there was a place in the hills where a young woman served coffee and did not ask questions. Maeve welcomed all of them. She did not charge for the coffee. She never had, and she never would. When visitors asked how much they owed, she shook her head and told them the coffee was free. But people left things anyway. A jar of honey from a beekeeper in the next valley. A loaf of bread still warm from the oven. A handful of wildflowers picked from the meadow at the top of the ridge. A $5 bill folded small and tucked into the tin can she had set on the bench, not as payment but as thanks. The tin can filled up slowly. Maeve used the money to buy more coffee, more mugs, more of the small things that made visitors feel welcome. The cycle continued, giving and receiving, receiving and giving in the old rhythm of hospitality that had existed long before anyone invented cash registers or credit cards. Chester Webb brought her a sign. He had made it himself in his workshop, cutting the letters by hand from a piece of white oak he had been saving for something special. The sign said, Whitlock JCT Coffee, in simple block letters painted dark green to match the original station sign above the bay window. He hung it on the post at the edge of the platform, where anyone walking down the old rail bed would see it. Maeve protested. She said she was not running a business. She said she did not want people to think they had to pay. Chester just smiled and drove another nail into the post. A sign does not mean you are selling anything, he said. It just means you are here. Dorrit Schultz brought a string of small white lights to hang along the eaves. She said the winter evenings came early in the valley and visitors might appreciate being able to find the depot in the dark. Maeve helped her hang the lights on a Saturday afternoon in late October. They worked slowly, methodically, the way women have always worked on tasks that require patience and precision. When they finished, they stood in the clearing and looked at the depot, with its new constellation of tiny stars glowing against the darkening sky. It looks like a place now, Dorrit said, like a real place. Maeve did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing. But she understood what Dorrit meant. A place is not just a building. A place is what happens inside the building. The accumulated weight of moments and conversations and small kindnesses. A place is what you make it one day at a time, one visitor at a time, one cup of coffee at a time. Whitlock Junction was becoming a place again. Aldrich Moser built her a new bench. He showed up one morning in early November with the back of his truck full of lumber. White oak, he said, from a barn in the next valley that was being torn down. The barn had been built in 1887, and the wood had been seasoning for over a century. It was harder than iron and smoother than silk, and it would last another 100 years if you treated it right. He spent 3 days building the bench. Maeve offered to help, but he waved her away. This was his work, he said. This was what he knew how to do. When he finished, the bench was a beautiful thing, simple and strong with clean lines and no unnecessary ornamentation. It fit perfectly on the platform in the spot where the original bench had stood before it rotted away. Aldrich sat on the bench and looked out at the rail bed. He was quiet for a long time. My father worked on this line, he said. Finally. Section gang back in the 30s. He used to bring me out here when I was a boy, and we would sit on the platform and wait for the trains to come through. I remember the sound they made coming around the curve. You could hear them a long time before you could see them. He paused. I have not thought about that in years. Funny how a place can bring things back. Maeve sat beside him on the new bench. She did not say anything. Some moments do not need words. They sat together until the sun went down, 2 people on a bench on an empty platform, watching the light fade over the Allegheny Hills. The winter came hard that year. Snow fell in early December and did not melt until March. The temperature dropped below zero on 17 different nights. The wind came down from the north and found every crack and gap in the old building, no matter how carefully Maeve had sealed them. She learned to bank the fire in the pot-bellied stove before she went to bed, adding just enough coal to keep the embers alive until morning. She learned to sleep in layers with the wool blanket and an old quilt that Dorrit had given her, and her coat spread over the top of everything. She learned that the cold was not her enemy, not if she respected it. The cold was simply a fact of life in the mountains, as much a part of the place as the trees in the river and the empty rail bed. Visitors still came even in the worst weather. Fewer than in summer, but they came. A man who had driven 3 hours through a snowstorm because his father had worked on the Bedford branch in the 1950s, and he wanted to see what was left. A couple who had gotten lost on the back roads and stumbled onto the depot by accident and stayed for 2 hours drinking coffee and talking about their lives. A woman who came alone on Christmas Eve and sat on the platform bench and cried without explaining why, and Maeve did not ask. Maeve served them all coffee. She listened to their stories. She let them stay as long as they needed to stay, and she did not charge them anything. And when they left, they took something with them that they had not had when they arrived. She did not know what to call it. Peace, maybe. Or hope. Or just the simple knowledge that there was still a place in the world where a stranger would give you a cup of coffee and expect nothing in return. Whatever it was, the visitors carried it away with them out into the snow, back to their cars and their lives and their own private struggles. And Maeve stayed behind, keeping the fire burning, keeping the coffee hot, keeping watch over the depot the way Emmett Yoder had kept watch for 26 years, waiting for whoever came next. Spring arrived slowly, the way it always does in the mountains. First, the snow melted from the south-facing slopes, leaving patches of bare brown earth that looked like wounds in the white landscape. Then, the ice on the river began to break up, grinding and groaning as it moved downstream. Then the first green shoots appeared in the meadow at the edge of the clearing, tiny flags of color against the gray. By April, the woods were coming back to life. Birds returned from wherever they had spent the winter. Squirrels emerged from their nests and began chattering at each other in the treetops. The air smelled different, cleaner, full of the promise of warmth and growth. Maeve threw open the windows of the waiting room and let the spring breeze sweep through. She beat the dust out of the curtains and scrubbed the slate floor and polished the brass hardware until it shone. The depot had survived its first winter under her care. It had kept her warm and dry through the coldest nights. It had sheltered her from the storms and the wind and the long, dark evenings. It felt like home now. Not the home she had grown up in, not the row house in Scranton with its memories of loss and abandonment. A different kind of home. A home she had built herself, one board and one nail and one cup of coffee at a time. She wrote a letter to Hetty that spring. She did not write many letters. She did not have many people to write to. But Hetty was different. Hetty had taken her in when she had nowhere else to go. Hetty had given her a room and a job and a booth in the back where she could be safe. Hetty had kept the photograph of her father for years, waiting for the right time to return it. The letter was not long. Maeve was not good with words on paper, but she tried to explain what had happened, what the depot had become, what she had learned about patience and waiting, and the way small kindnesses accumulate into something larger. She told Hetty about the coffee and the visitors and the sign that Chester had made. She told her about the bench that Aldrich had built, and the lights that Dorrit had hung, and the cold winter nights when the fire in the stove was the only warm thing in the world. She told her that she was happy, not the loud, obvious kind of happiness that announces itself with laughter and celebration, a quieter kind. The happiness of a plant that has finally found the right soil, the right light, the right conditions to grow. Hetty wrote back 2 weeks later. The letter was short, just a few lines in Hetty's cramped handwriting. But those few lines said everything that needed to be said. "Brennan girl," it said, "I knew you would find your way. Some people are built for the places that other people have forgotten. Keep the coffee hot. Keep the fire burning. And remember that the people who wait at small stations are doing holy work, even if nobody ever tells them so." Maeve read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it carefully and put it in the tin lockbox with Emmett Yoder's letter and the other things that mattered too much to leave lying around. 2 letters from 2 people who understood what it meant to wait. The summer of her 2nd year at the depot was the busiest yet. Word had continued to spread through the networks of hikers and historians and railroad enthusiasts. A travel writer had mentioned the depot in an article about hidden gems in the Allegheny foothills. A photography website had featured pictures of the platform and the rail bed and the bay window with its original sign. Visitors came almost every day now. Some stayed for an hour. Some stayed for an entire afternoon. A few asked if they could spend the night, and Maeve let them sleep on the bench in the waiting room the way she had slept on her first night at Whitlock Junction. She never turned anyone away. The tin can on the bench filled up faster than she could empty it. She used the money for improvements, for maintenance, for the endless small repairs that an old building requires. New shingles where the wind had torn the old ones loose. New glass for a window that had cracked in the winter cold. New hinges for the waiting room door which had begun to sag on its frame. The depot was teaching her. Every day brought a new lesson in the art of keeping an old building alive. Every problem had a solution if you were patient enough to find it. Every repair was a conversation with the craftsman who had built the place a century ago, a silent negotiation between what they had intended and what time had made necessary. Maeve found that she liked this work. She liked the feel of wood grain beneath her fingers, and the smell of fresh sawdust, and the satisfaction of seeing something broken become whole again. She liked knowing that she was part of a chain that stretched back to 1898, when the depot was first built, and forward into a future she could not see. Someday someone else would stand where she was standing, making the same repairs, having the same conversations with the same silent craftsman. That was what it meant to be a steward, not an owner, not a possessor. A steward, someone who cared for a thing that was bigger than themselves, older than themselves, more permanent than any single human life. On a clear evening in late October, Maeve sat on Aldrich's bench and watched the sun go down over the ridge. The leaves had turned and the hills were ablaze with color, red and orange and gold. The last bright shout of the year before the gray silence of winter descended. The air was cool but not yet cold, and the sky was the deep, clear blue that only comes in autumn when the humidity is burned off, and you can see forever. She held 2 pocket watches in her hands. In her left hand, her grandfather's silver watch on its worn leather cord. The watch that Seamus Brennan had carried for 32 years through every kind of Pennsylvania weather. on every mile of track between Scranton and Pittsburgh. The watch that he had passed to her father, and that her father had worn until the day he died. In her right hand, the Hamilton 992B that Emmett Yoder had left behind. The railroad-issue timepiece that had kept the schedule at Whitlock Junction from 1934 until that final evening in June of 1958, when Emmett had written 6:42 p.m. eastbound finals on the chalkboard and walked away for the last time. Maeve opened both watches and held them up to the fading light. They showed exactly the same time, accurate to the second, synchronized without any coordination, simply because both of them had been set and wound according to the same principles, the same standards, the same belief that knowing the precise time was a form of respect for the people who depended on you. Railroad time. She looked at the watches for a long time, thinking about the men who had carried them. Seamus, who had ridden the cabooses through blizzards and heat waves and fog, so thick you could not see your hand in front of your face. Emmett, who had sat in the ticket booth for 26 years watching trains come and go, making coffee for brakemen who were not part of his official duties. Two men who had never met. Two men who had lived in different places, in different circumstances, with different families and different fates. But they had believed in the same things. Precision, duty, the quiet dignity of showing up when you said you would and doing what you said you would do. They had believed that small kindnesses mattered, that a cup of coffee on a cold morning could be the difference between a good day and a hard one. That patience was not passive, not weak, not a failure to act. Patience was a kind of action in itself, a way of keeping faith with the future, even when the future seemed impossibly far away. Maeve closed the watches and held them against her chest. She thought about her grandfather Seamus, who had quit school at 15 to support his family, and had spent the rest of his life on the railroad, never late, never complaining, keeping time in his breast pocket like a sacred trust. She thought about her father Declan, who had tried to escape the railroad and found that he could not, who had walked out of an insurance office one Monday morning because the coat felt like it belonged to someone else, who had spent the last years of his life with grease on his hands and diesel in his hair and a peace in his heart that he had never found behind a desk. She thought about Emmett Yoder, who had saved a portion of every paycheck in a lockbox beneath the floor waiting for someone he would never meet, who had written a letter to whoever finds this and trusted that whoever would be worthy of the trust. She thought about her mother Nora, who had loved one man so completely that losing him had broken something that could not be repaired, who had taped a note to a door because she could not bear to look at the daughter who reminded her of everything she had lost. Maeve understood now in a way she had not understood before that her mother had not meant to push her toward a new life. Her mother had only wanted to make her own grief quieter. She had not been capable of thinking about what Maeve needed, because her own need had swallowed everything else. It was not an excuse. It was not forgiveness. But it was understanding, which was maybe the first step towards something that might someday resemble peace. The doors that other people close are sometimes the doors that turn us toward the doors that have been waiting for us. Maeve looked out at the empty railbed glowing in the last light of the setting sun. She had walked down that railbed 2 years ago, carrying nothing but a duffel bag and $10 and a pocket watch on a leather cord. She had not known what she was looking for. She had not known that anything was waiting for her, but something had been waiting. The depot had been waiting. Emmett Yoder had been waiting in the only way a dead man can wait, through the words he had left behind and the gift he had hidden beneath the floor. And now she was the one waiting. She was the station agent at Whitlock Junction, the keeper of the coffee and the fire and the old building that had learned to be patient. She was the one who welcomed visitors and listened to their stories and let them stay as long as they needed to stay. She was the one holding the watch, keeping time, maintaining the schedule even though the trains had stopped running 60 years ago. That was the thing about small stations. A small station does not stop being a station just because the trains have stopped coming. It keeps the schedule in its bones. It keeps the coffee in its kettle. It keeps the lockbox under the floor, and the flag folded in its triangular fold, and the pocket watch wound on the desk. All the small, honest things that the last person who loved the building had set down before they turned the key in the door. A small station waits. It has always waited. That is what a station is. And when the next person finally walks down the rail bed in the cold, carrying nothing but a duffel bag and $10 and a watch on a leather cord, the station does not need to speak. Stations do not speak. It only needs to show her the loose floorboards beneath the stool. The sun touched the ridge and began to sink below it. The colors of the sky deepened. Red fading to purple, purple fading to blue. The first stars appeared, faint points of light in the darkening vault. Maeve sat on the bench that Aldrich had built from 100-year-old oak. She held the two watches against her chest, feeling them tick in unison, keeping the same time, beating the same steady rhythm. Behind her, the string of white lights that Dorrit had hung began to glow as the darkness gathered. The depot stood solid and patient. In the clearing, its windows lit from within, smoke rising from its chimney. The sign that Chester had made visible at the edge of the platform. Whitlock JCT Coffee. Not a business, not a destination. Just a place where a stranger could stop and rest and have a cup of coffee, and be reminded that small kindnesses still existed in the world. Emmett Yoder had waited for Maeve Brennan for more than 60 years without knowing her name. Seamus had waited for her in the shape of a flat-top silver pocket watch on a worn leather cord, passed down through her father and into her hands. Declan had waited for her in the smell of diesel and the names of freight cars she could still recite by heart. Boxcars and gondolas and hoppers and tank cars and reefers. Hedwig Wisniewski had waited for her in the back booth of a diner in Scranton with a fresh pot of coffee and an unspoken understanding that some people carry things they do not want to talk about. Dorrit Schultz and Aldrich Moser and Chester Webb had waited for her too, each in their own quiet Pennsylvania way. Each without knowing that they were waiting, without expecting anything, without asking for anything in return. They had simply been there, ready when the young woman finally walked down the county road in the cold and signed her name in her grandfather's slanted hand. Maeve Brennan was 20 years old and homeless. She had $10 to her name and no family who would open the door for her. She spent those $10 on an abandoned train depot in the Allegheny foothills of central Pennsylvania, in a township so small it had stopped appearing on maps. It was the best $10 she ever spent. The night deepened around the depot. The stars wheeled slowly overhead. The same stars that had shone down on Whitlock Junction when the trains still ran, the same stars that would shine down long after Maeve was gone and someone else had taken her place. The coffee stayed hot on the stove. The fire crackled in the grate. The two pocket watches ticked side by side on the desk in the ticket booth, keeping railroad time, keeping faith with the men who had carried them and the woman who carried them now. Somewhere in the valley, the river ran on toward the sea. The same river that Emmett Yoder had listened to on quiet nights, the same river that Seamus Brennan had heard from the platform at midnight when he was a young brakeman on temporary assignment to the Bedford branch. The river did not care about the passage of years or the closure of rail lines or the small dramas of human lives. The river simply ran the way it had always run, the way it would always run. And the depot waited the way it had always waited, the way it would always wait. Because that is what stations do. They wait. In the morning, Maeve would wake with the sun. She would add wood to the fire and put the kettle on and wind the two pocket watches and set them to railroad time. She would sweep the platform and check the supplies and make a list of the small repairs that needed doing before winter came again. She would wait for visitors, and when they came, she would welcome them. She would serve them coffee and listen to their stories and let them stay as long as they needed to stay. She would not charge them anything. She would not ask them for anything. She would simply be there the way Emmett Yoder had been there. For 26 years, the way her grandfather had been there for the passengers who depended on him to arrive on time. Some people are built for the places that other people have forgotten. Some people are built for waiting. Maeve Brennan was one of them. She had come to Whitlock Junction with nothing but a duffel bag and $10 in the silver pocket watch that her grandfather had carried for 32 years. She had found a letter from a man who had been dead for decades. A man who had believed that patience always finds the person it has been waiting for. She had found $9,320 and 11 silver dollars in a Hamilton 992B in a silver hunting case. She had found a home. Not the home she had been born into. Not the home she had been thrown out of. A different kind of home. A home that had been waiting for her since 1958. Since the day Emmett Yoder wrote his letter and hid his lockbox and walked away from the station he had loved for 26 years. A home that would wait for whoever came after her the way it had waited for her. The way small stations always wait. The lights of the depot glowed in the darkness. The smoke rose from the chimney. The sign at the edge of the platform announced to anyone who cared to read it that there was coffee here and warmth and a welcome for whoever needed one. Maeve sat on the bench and watched the stars and held the two pocket watches against her heart. She was 22 years old now. She had been at Whitlock Junction for 2 years. She had learned how to shingle a roof and hang a door and keep a fire burning through the coldest nights. She had learned that patience is not passive. Patience is a kind of faith. Faith that the waiting has a purpose, even when you cannot see what the purpose is. Faith that the person you are waiting for will come even when you do not know their name. Faith that the small kindnesses you offer to strangers will matter somehow, in ways you will never know and can never measure. Emmett Yoder had had that faith. He had hidden his lockbox and written his letter, and trusted that whoever finds this would be worthy of finding it. Maeve had that faith now. She would keep the coffee hot. She would keep the fire burning. She would keep the watches wound and the floor swept and the door open for whoever came down the rail bed next. She would wait, because that is what station agents do. That is what Brennans do. That is what people who love old buildings and old ways and old promises do. They wait. And someday when Maeve was old and gray and ready to pass the waiting on to someone else, she would write her own letter. She would hide it somewhere in the depot, in a place that only patience and curiosity would find. And she would trust that the person who found it would understand. She would trust that they would keep the coffee hot and the fire burning and the watches wound. She would trust that they would wait the way she had waited, the way Emmett had waited, the way the depot itself had waited, since the last train pulled away in June of 1958. The night was deep and quiet and full of stars. The depot glowed with light and warmth. The two pocket watches ticked in unison, keeping time, keeping faith, keeping watch over the young woman who had found her way to the loneliest station on the line and made it her home. Maeve Brennan closed her eyes and listened to the river in the valley below. She smiled. She was exactly where she was supposed to be.